welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am your host, Jessica, and I am here with the author of a book called Let's Call Her Barbie, and her name is Renée Rosen, and she's written a bunch of really cool historical novels, and this one, obviously, we're all sort of coming off of the whole Barbie mania from the year before, which I know you had an interesting sort of meeting of the minds with that. Like this was planned beforehand.
Correct.
So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us a little bit about this book?
I'm Renée Rosen. I write historical fiction. And this is Let's Call Her Barbie is my 9th book. I tend to write about strong women. In the past, I've written about Helen Gurley Brown, who was the first editor-in-chief of Cosmopolitan magazine, about Estee Lauder, her rise in the cosmetic industry, Alva Vanderbilt and Caroline Astor vying for control of New York society. So that's kind of my sweet spot, are strong, empowering women. And Let's Call Her Barbie, at the heart of that is Ruth Handler, who created the Barbie doll, along with a whole team of creative rebels at Mattel. And, you know, for people who saw the movie and all and saw Rhea Perlman in those really touching scenes, that was Ruth Handler. And even though this is a work of fiction, I have to say it's based on fact, and fact is stranger than fiction. I could not have dreamed up so much of the history of what went into creating Barbie and bringing her to market.
So I've been following just a bunch of things about it. I will confess right here that I was not a Barbie girl growing up, and I wasn't even really a baby doll girl, which we'll kind of get into because that's a big part of Barbie. I was a little bit more of the action figure type, but I absolutely respect just sort of the universe of Barbie, and I followed the story of Ruth Handler and the people who brought Barbie to life, both through books and also there was this wonderful TV series called The Toys That Made Us, which to me was fabulous because that particular episode was the most fascinating of the entire series. Like, it was more cutthroat than any of the toys that were quote unquote marketed to boys. Really just more like just a lot juicier. So I find it all very interesting. And of course, I did see the Barbie movie, which I thought was a lot of fun. It was a movie for people who are Barbie people and people who weren't and everyone in between. But I think at the root of it, of your book, you bring together just how much of a rebellion it was for somebody like Ruth Handler to basically say, we're going to make a doll and she's not going to be a baby doll, because up until that point, all the dolls that were marketed to girls were basically like, let's prepare them for motherhood. Let's, it's got to be a baby. And Barbie was completely different. Her vision was basically, when you say girls can be anything, that was her thought. Let's have a woman who lives a life. She, has beautiful clothes, she has jobs, and obviously people were not ready to jive with that just yet. So
not at all.
So talk a little bit about, first of all, just sort of characterizing Ruth in your book, how you kind of went about that, and then how the other characters all wove in. And then, I also wanted at one point we can do this slowly, talk about Stevie, who's kind of our gateway into this world.
Yeah. So, first we have to understand that Barbie's DNA was a German prostitute novelty gag doll for men. She was not a toy. Bill Lilly grew out of a comic strip about a prostitute. And if you looked at Bill Lilly and that original Barbie doll, it's very hard to distinguish which was which. Having said that, when Ruth Handler got the idea that, her son Ken had toy soldiers, he had trains, he had trucks, he had toy guns to play with. Her daughter Barbara, you cannot make this stuff up, all Barbara had were baby dolls. And as you said, that just perpetuated that stereotype that little boys can be anything and little girls are going to be mommies, maybe a nurse. And Ruth had observed that Barbara, as she got a little bit older, was playing with paper dolls. And for those who are too young to remember paper dolls, they were really flimsy. They had outfits, but you had to hold them on with little paper tabs. And, Ruth kept thinking if there's only this three-dimensional doll that girls could play with, then they could be empowered to live a life where they did have a job, they did have a home, a car, even before women were, able to obtain those things on their own. And then she's in Europe with her family and she spots Build Lily in a souvenir shop window. And she's like, bam, that's the doll I'm thinking of. Then she brings it back to Mattel. And even her husband, Elliot, was like, Ruth, this is indecent. You cannot give little girls a doll with breasts to play with. And Ruth persisted. Then she got Jack Ryan, who was the head engineer at Mattel, on board. He was the first man to share in Ruth's vision that she was really onto something. And Jack Ryan, man, I could not have dreamed up a character as rich as Jack Ryan. He came out of Yale. He was an engineer. He worked for Raytheon. He actually did Hawk and Sparrow missiles for the Pentagon, for the Army, before coming over to Mattel. The guy was brilliant. He was a genius. He had many, many demons, including being bipolar, being a sex addict, an alcoholic, et cetera, et cetera. But the most surprising thing was that at 5'5", 5'8", with his 3-inch elevator shoes, he was the heartthrob of Mattel. The women went gaga for him. So he was so instrumental in designing Barbie and coming up with a way, to manufacture her. Build Lily was made out of a very hard plastic. They wanted something that was softer for Barbie. And, the degree of detail and everything, he had to go to Japan to find a place that could cost effectively manufacture her. So Jack played a very, very pivotal part in Barbie's history. If Ruth was the mother of Barbie, then Jack was certainly the father of Barbie. And then we have Charlotte Johnson, who she was the first Barbie fashion designer. And I think one of the most misunderstood things about Barbie, she's often criticized for presenting an unrealistic standard of beauty for women and a body image. But that body image was driven by the clothing. If you think about it, Barbie was 1/6 the scale of a real woman who was approximately 5'9" and weighed an undernourished 110 pounds. But that being said, there's no such thing as 1/6 scale of fabric. Fabric is fabric is fabric. So when Charlotte Johnson was making those beautiful original Barbie outfits, to make the waistbands with the zippers and the little hooks and eyes and the buttons, it all added bulk. So unless Barbie's waistline was abnormally thin at 18 inches, when she was fully dressed, her waistline would have been bigger than her hips because of the clothing. Same reason why she wears a size 3 shoe. If she had a size 7, it would look completely clown-like on her. So there was a lot of optical illusion. And you had asked me about Stevie Klein, who I often like to introduce a fictional element into my historical fiction, because my feeling has always been if you could go to a Wikipedia article and read about it, you don't need me to write a novel about it. Stevie gave me a portal into that world of Mattel that would be different from Ruth's, different from Jack, Charlotte's, and it shows the impact that Barbie had on a young fashion designer, not to mention the impact that Jack Ryan had on a young fashion designer. But she's just there as a vehicle.
So let's backtrack a little bit and talk about when you started this project, because you had said that this began for you before the Barbie movie was announced.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It probably began for me as a little girl playing Barbies because I have very, very intricate Barbie
Yeah, that was
storylines.
actually my next question was, were you like a big Barbie girl when you were
Huge,
younger?
huge, huge. I never went anywhere without my Barbie case. And I'm sure I was a pain in the butt for my friends to play with because they just wanted to put on the clothes and have like makeout sessions. And I was very, very involved in the storylines, like Barbie and Ken cannot just split off to Paris. They're having financial problems and they're in the middle of a fight. Ken's got a gambling problem. All that needs to be resolved before
That
any of this can
tracks. Of
happen.
course he does.
So, I was very hung up on that stuff even then. But then fast forward, it was right before my book Park Avenue Summer came out. I was on a panel about feminism, and someone on the panel was very high up in the doll division at Mattel. And she told me the story of Ruth Handler, and I just got goosebumps. And I said, "Oh my God, has anyone ever done a novel on this?" And she said, "I don't think so." And so I had two other books already in the pipeline. And Barbie, I think prior to the movie, Barbie was still very much a lightning rod. I think that movie did a lot for her PR, for her image, and acceptability. So I had wanted to write this book since then. And then the movie came out. And then talk about FOMO. And I was a little panicked. They were so hush hush about what the movie was going to be. And then when they released that first trailer, I don't know if you remember where it's Barbie and the, zebra stripe bathing suit and all the
Yes.
girls are breaking their baby dolls. And I literally, my stomach just sank and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be my book. And thankfully the movie went off in a much different
A
direction.
much, much, much different
Yeah.
direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was like, phew. But I think the timing for this book is landing better than had it come out during the movie. I think it would have gotten lost.
Well, for sure, because as much as the movie is kind of a love letter to just the changing face of feminism and the changing face of femininity and, how we see things, this is a little bit more grounded in what needed to happen in order to push forward. And I think when you say that the movie did kind of change the PR for Barbie, I do think it lands better now that people are kind of, looking back a little bit and just kind of
Yeah.
thinking less about Barbie's dimensions or, and
Yeah.
a little bit more about just the social impact. And I think like one of the things that was brilliant about the movie, which again, I think helps a book that's more realistic work, is that in the end, the movie was slightly jaded and, more like, well, why is this important? Why are we still talking about Barbie all these years later
Yeah.
when all of these things, are happening and you have one of the original Barbie lovers who works for the company who, I'm not going to give any spoilers, but she's not too happy with the way certain things are going, which is a big part of the story. And, and Barbie herself kind of having a self-aware moment. I think that if this book came out beforehand, I think it wouldn't have gathered the love that it has because I think people were not looking at Barbie in that way beforehand. They would be like, oh, yeah, this is interesting. But we're talking a lot more about Ruth Handler
Yeah.
now, and, whether or not Rhea Perlman was a, depiction of her. I mean, she was like a powerhouse, really.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Mattel in general, like, was a company that started out with picture frames, it
Right.
like
Right.
it was just the fact that she really took the company took that part of the company over when it was really named after her husband and their business
His
partner at
first
the time.
partner,
Yeah,
the first
exactly.
partner was Harold
Yep.
Matson and Elliot Handler. So it was Matt and Elle Mattel.
Uh-huh.
And of course, Ruth never thought about it at the time, but that really sort of struck in her craw that, it wasn't her name. And she was the engine behind Mattel. Mattel would not have happened. Barbie for sure wouldn't have happened, but even Mattel would never have been what it turned out to be and continues to be had it not been for Ruth. And, even if people are not Barbie fans, This book is really, it's a business caper in a lot of ways, because
Yeah.
it's a woman who is really butting heads with the patriarchy all the way, and just all the shenanigans that went on.
And launches an empire,
Yeah, yeah,
who like will not back down and launches an empire in the face of everybody who's telling her nobody wants this.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I think that is really it resonates, and I think it did have to kind of come full circle. So in a way, I am glad that this book is out now for you. What was the most interesting thing that you garnered, like a pearl that you found while you were doing research for this book?
Oh my God, there was so much. I think aside from why Barbie's body, her measurements and all that, I was very shocked that, like yourself, Ruth Handler didn't play with dolls. She didn't play with toys at all. She was a serious cookie from the get-go. Other things that really surprised me, and given, everything we've said up to this point, was that Barbie had completely flopped at Toy Fair when they introduced her in March 9th of 1959. All everybody said was, you see the doll with the breasts. Like, nobody took her seriously. And Barbie could have died on the vine right then and there. And Ruth just refused to give in. She just refused to surrender.
I did love learning about Charlotte Johnson. I mean, we know a lot about Jack Ryan. He was also, as we know, he was one of Zsa Zsa Gabor's many husbands for
Yes,
like a
yes,
fortnight.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh my God. And his parties, he had this mansion in Bel Air that he turned into a castle. And he had these parties that were compared to Hugh Hefner's at the Playboy Mansion. So, yeah, he was great fun to work with as a character.
Yeah, just the whole idea of somebody really, I never thought of somebody who had to design that wardrobe. I mean, that's again like such a big part of who Barbie is. And learning about Charlotte Johnson, like I said, it had never crossed my mind.
Yeah.
Like, yes, she is a fashion doll in many ways. Fashion is a big part of Barbie. But yeah, like you have fashion designers, you have to have a fashion designer for a doll. Like that was
Yeah.
again, I felt
And
very
she had
stupid and it blew my mind.
But everything had to be recalibrated for a doll that size with that kind of detail. There weren't buttons that size, there weren't zippers that size. If you even ordinary thread would have been so thick for Barbie's standards. So, and those outfits had really delicate top stitching and all that. All that had to be done. And so Charlotte spent a great deal of time in Japan as well, trying to work with the seamstresses there so that they could mass produce these outfits. She went to Paris to watch the fashion runways to see what was going to be the next hot thing, because Barbie had to be in style. Barbie had to be in step with that. And I thought this was genius on Ruth's part. She knew from the get-go that Barbie's wardrobe was going to be like razor blades. The razor wasn't cheap. It was inexpensive. Barbie herself only retailed for $3. It was the clothes that they made their money on. And it was, that whole razor blade theory. And Ruth recognized that right from the get-go. And that's why she pushed, I need Charlotte.
Well, again, this was great. I would talk a little bit more about want you to talk a little bit more about Midge and Skipper, but I want people to read the book. I don't want you to give too much out there because that's part of the book too. Adding more characters into Barbie's
Yeah.
life other than, the Barbie and Ken. But I want to thank you very much. This was very interesting. I think people are really gonna like it. Are you working on another book at the moment?
I'm just at the very, very beginning stages. It's been hard for me to let go of Barbie. I'm kind of going through a little bit of a grieving period. I miss my characters and I miss that world. So I'm just at the very, very edge of something new. But I do have another book coming.
Well, very exciting. Thank you so much, Renee Rosen. This was super, super fun. I really appreciate you coming on and chatting with us.
Thank you. It's been fun.
All right. This was Jessica with Turn the Page podcast. My guest was
Renee Rosen.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.